Hey guys, tonight we're floating back a few centuries. So go ahead, dim the lights, stretch out your legs, and let your mind settle into that pleasantly heavy, about to fall asleep feeling. Because tonight we're taking a slow, quiet walk through one of history's most overstimulating eras. But don't worry, I'll make it sound as gentle and boring as humanly possible. Welcome to the Renaissance, a period that school textbooks love to hype as the spark of modernity, the rebirth of culture, the age of genius, the dawn of human potential, basically a 24/7 parade of Michelangelos and Da Vinci's popping out masterpieces like an assembly line. But we're not doing the dramatic version. We're doing the sleepy version. The version where Europe kinda wakes up from a medieval nap, rubs its eyes, mutters, wait, what if we learn things? And then slowly stumbles into a few centuries of artistic overachieving. So, get comfortable, and let's drift into the ever-so-slow rebirth of art, science, and questionable grooming habits. Let's start with medieval Europe, the before picture. Before anything was reborn, Europe had to go through a long, awkward phase where everything smelled vaguely like damp wool. The Middle Ages weren't exactly a cultural desert. It wasn't all mud-loving peasants and Gregorian monks humming at stone walls. But compared to what was coming, it was a little flat. Imagine an entire continent running on autopilot. Agriculture? Same as before. Feudalism? Still doing its thing, grinding everyone's knees into the mud. Education? Available if you were a monk or a noble boy who could tolerate being smacked with a wax tablet for incorrect Latin declensions. Art? Mostly religious, mostly stiff, and everyone's proportions look like someone drew them after staring directly into the sun. Europe wasn't asleep. It was more like it was lying on the couch, half watching the same rerun for centuries. But beneath the surface, things were shifting, slowly, quietly, almost grudgingly. A slightly warmer climate boosted food production. Towns started growing, and trade routes expanded like Europe was rediscovering that other humans existed. And with trade came merchants, and with merchants came money. And with money came people who wanted fancy things on their walls. And nothing wakes up a continent faster than the prospect of flexing on your neighbors with expensive art. Italian city-states, Europe's overachieving cousins. So let's float over to Italy, Renaissance headquarters. Not a unified country yet, just a patchwork of wealthy city-states that acted like competitive siblings from a dysfunctional billionaire family. Florence, Venice, Milan, Rome, each one dripping with cash from banking, shipping, or in Rome's case, centuries of religious taxes and a healthy belief that God wants us to renovate. These cities weren't just rich, they were aggressively rich. The kind of rich where you can commission 10-foot marble statues just to fill the empty corner of your courtyard because you're tired of looking at the potted plant. And of course, the people running these cities were the elites, families with so much money and political control that they practically radiated smugness. The Medici family, Renaissance sugar daddies. Let's start with Florence, home of the Medici. Imagine a family that begins as humble bankers and somehow ends up steering European culture so hard that half the Renaissance owes them royalties. Cosimo de' Medici, Cosimo the Elder, basically bought Florence without technically buying it. He funded libraries, art workshops, architecture, and more scholars than he could personally name. He was like the quiet guy who finances half the town, but pretends he's just doing his part. Then there was Lorenzo de' Medici, Lorenzo the Magnificent, a man so deeply Renaissance core that he could write poetry, run a government, and sponsor a teenage Michelangelo while simultaneously dodging assassination plots. Spoiler, he could not. But the Medici funded him anyway, because in the Renaissance, hope was a financial strategy. Now, if the Renaissance had a software patch, it would be humanism. Humanism didn't mean everyone was suddenly nice because, no. These people continued to feud, poison, invade, and backstab like medieval champions. Humanism meant scholars started thinking, what if we, I don't know, actually read the ancient texts instead of trusting the guy who summarized them 900 years ago? It was a revolutionary concept, almost too modern. So scholars dug up lost manuscripts from ancient Greece and Rome like they were treasure maps. They studied languages, grammar, history, philosophy, and they did it with the enthusiasm of university students who suddenly realized their major might get them a real job. This shift didn't replace religion. It just elbowed itself beside it. People could now believe in God and believe in studying the natural world. They could admire saints and admire the clean jaw rinds of Greek statues that mysteriously had no body hair. Humanism encouraged curiosity, observation, individual achievement. Basically the intellectual equivalent of opening a window for the first time and realizing you've been living in a dim hallway. Art. When Europe suddenly learns anatomy. Let's drift gently into Renaissance art, because nothing captures the spirit of this period like the moment painters realized, oh, humans actually have bones inside them. Medieval art had its charms, but Renaissance artists took one look at those flat, expressionless saints floating on gold backgrounds and collectively said, yeah, no. They wanted realism, depth, shadows, the ability to paint a hand that didn't look like a bunch of cooked spaghetti pressed together. Linear perspective, the cheat code. Then came linear perspective, straight lines that made objects look like they were actually receding instead of falling over. Filippo Brunelleschi basically walked into Florence one day and said, guys, I cracked it. I figured out how to make paintings look like they're happening in real space. And the entire art world stopped mid-brushstroke, gasped softly, and immediately tried to copy him. Perspective was the Renaissance equivalent of adding 3D glasses to a 2D movie. Suddenly, artists could paint entire cities that looked real enough to make you want to check for property taxes. Light and shadow. Artists discovered the sun. Then painters started studying how light falls on objects. Chiaroscuro, contrast between light and dark, appeared like some sort of artistic revelation. To be fair, medieval artists didn't know light existed. They just didn't care what it did. But Renaissance artists obsessed over it. They watched how sunlight touched cheekbones, how shadows formed under chins, how fabric folds behaved like they had personal drama. It was the golden age of noticing things. Leonardo da Vinci, the Renaissance guy who did too much. Let's float gently into our first major figure, Leonardo da Vinci. Painter, scientist, engineer, anatomist, inventor, occasional procrastinator, basically the human version of having too many tabs open. He was not that interested in finishing paintings. He was more interested in understanding everything, everywhere, at all times, with the energy of someone who drank too much herbal tea. His notebooks are filled with sketches of human skulls, flying machines, hydraulic pumps, and that one weird dude who always appears in the margins. He performed dissections just to see how tendons worked. He observed water flow with poetic melancholy. He designed war machines so impractical that even generals looked at them and said, "Leonardo, buddy, are you okay?" But he did paint a few things, including the Mona Lisa, which he carried around like a security blanket for years, touching it up every now and then because he could never decide if he was done. His other masterpiece, The Last Supper, was brilliant until the experimental point he used started flaking off faster than a cheap sticker. But that's Leonardo, a genius who lived in constant, unfinished project mode. Now, let's drift to Michelangelo, a man whose talent was matched only by his chronic irritation. Michelangelo was dramatic, stubborn, and always one insult away from storming out of the room. Yet, somehow, despite his constant complaining, he carved marble like the stone personally owed him money. His David looks like it's about to lecture you on human perfection. His Pietà has the calm emotional glow of an Instagram filter. And his Sistine Chapel ceiling.
All right, settle back in, let the thoughts slow down a little, and let's keep drifting through this gentle, oversized tapestry known as the Renaissance, Europe's long, slow transition from medieval fog to mild intellectual clarity. We've met some of the big artistic names, but the Renaissance wasn't just a talent show of artists with chronic back pain. It was a whole atmosphere, a vibe shift, a moment where the continent casually decided, what if we tried improving things? So let's glide forward and explore how this new way of thinking seeped into every corner of life: politics, science, daily culture, and, of course, the endlessly messy personal lives of the people driving the changes. The Renaissance mind. Curiosity with a side of drama. If the medieval mindset was about tradition and duty, the Renaissance mindset was more like, wait, can I ask a question? Actually, can I ask several thousand questions? This was the era when curiosity stopped being suspicious and started becoming fashionable. People didn't suddenly become geniuses overnight. They just became slightly more open to the idea that the world might be bigger, stranger, and more interesting than the nearest church fresco. The average scholar went from copying an old manuscript to arguing with it. Merchants went from counting coins to sponsoring poets for reasons no one totally understood. Princes went from brooding in dimly lit castles to showing off expensive art collections that suggested they too had taste. It was a cultural glow-up, but very slow and still a bit awkward. Wealthy patrons, the Renaissance's quiet power players. Let's float into the world of patronage, because the Renaissance wasn't powered by inspiration alone. It was powered by rich people who wanted everyone to know they were rich. Funding artists, scientists, architects, and scholars became the Renaissance version of collecting luxury cars. Only instead of getting a Mercedes, you got a fresco of a muscular biblical hero staring dramatically into the middle distance. Florence, where money makes art happen. We talked about the Medici, but they weren't the only ones tossing money around. Florence was filled with banking families who treated artistic commissions the way modern influencers treat limited edition sneakers. The more art you had, the more socially powerful you appeared. And nothing says respect me quite like a marble statue of a naked mythological figure in your courtyard. Venice, the city that ran on glitter. Now, Venice was over in its lagoon, shimmering like someone spilled gold dust on water and decided to build a city there. Venice loved art too, especially luxurious, colorful, light-soaked paintings, the kind that made you squint because the artist was trying so hard to show off how well they understood light reflection. Venetian elites funded theaters, public processions, massive oil paintings, and any portrait that made them look richer than their business rivals down the canal. Their artists became masters of color, detail, and capturing the exact texture of expensive fabrics. Because nothing matters more than making silk look like silk. Let's gently drift into Renaissance science. Now, art was dazzling, politics was chaotic, but science was slowly stretching its arms, yawning and wondering why no one had questioned Aristotle for 1,000 years. The Renaissance wasn't yet the scientific revolution. That comes later. This was the warm-up, the intellectual stretching session. People studied nature with something approaching seriousness. They examined plants, animals, human bodies, the stars, mathematics, even weather patterns, though mostly to complain about them. Anatomy, when scholars finally looked under the hood. For most of medieval Europe, dissecting bodies wasn't exactly encouraged. People weren't thrilled about poking around inside deceased humans. But Renaissance scholars, they were curious. Too curious sometimes. Anatomists began doing careful dissections to see how muscles, bones, and organs fit together, which honestly is more than we can say for medieval medical books that declared the liver was probably the center of emotion because it seemed important. One famous figure was Andreas Vesalius, a young anatomist who basically told the medical world, "Hey, all those old diagrams you've been trusting? Yeah, they're kind of wrong. Want to see what a body actually looks like?" And he proceeded to produce anatomical drawings so detailed that some viewers probably fainted out of sheer overwhelm. Vesalius didn't just teach anatomy. He rebooted the entire field with the kind of precision that made medieval physicians look like they were guessing, which, to be fair, many of them were. Mathematics, quiet brilliance in slow motion. Mathematics in the Renaissance was a calmer affair. No scandals, no dramatic feuds, just quiet men sitting in quiet rooms making quiet calculations. They refined algebra, improved geometry, introduced new numbering systems, developed practical tools traders and architects could actually use. Merchants helped spread more efficient bookkeeping, because nothing accelerates math research like the fear of miscalculating interest rates. And architects, like our friend Brunelleschi, used mathematics to design buildings that looked elegant instead of lopsided and sad. Everything became more measured, more precise, more competent. Europe wasn't brilliant yet, but it was getting the hang of accuracy. Printing press, the Renaissance acceleration button. Now, we can't float through this era without acknowledging the machine that supercharged everything, the printing press. Invented by Johannes Gutenberg around the 1450s, it was basically the Renaissance equivalent of inventing the Internet. Only instead of memes, people spread pamphlets arguing about theology and philosophy in the driest tones imaginable. Before printing, books were copied by hand. One book could take months or years. Imagine spending seasons hunched over parchment, copying letters until your eyes begged for mercy. Printing changed that. Suddenly, books became cheaper. Knowledge spread faster. Literacy rates increased. Slowly, but still. Scholars across Europe could actually read the same texts. Bad ideas spread just as quickly as good ideas, which is a very European tradition. The printing press didn't create new ideas. It just circulated them like a stiff breeze sweeping through a dusty room. And some elites found this terrifying because controlling information became harder when every teenager could, theoretically, own a book. Political power. Renaissance rulers with fragile egos. Now, let's drift into the world of Renaissance politics. Not the wars or battles we're keeping things calm tonight, but the personalities. Because Renaissance rulers, they were something else. They wanted to look modern, enlightened, stylish, and cultured, but they also wanted everyone to fear them just a little. A difficult balance. The stage. Courts filled with vanity. Royal courts became performance arenas where elites tried desperately to appear impressive. They hired poets to flatter them, architects to build them dramatic palaces, painters to immortalize their cheekbones, musicians to play at their fancy dinners because silence was awkward. Every prince wanted to seem like a philosopher king, but most were just nervous men in velvet hats worrying about taxes and cousins plotting against them. The Sforza of Milan. Strong opinions and stronger jawlines. They ruled with theatrical flair. They commissioned art like it was going out of style. And they participated in political schemes that required more confidence than competence. Ludovico Sforza, in particular, loved arts, fashion, and very questionable strategic decisions. He sponsored Leonardo da Vinci, which was a good move. He also got involved in enough political messes to nearly lose the family fortune, which was
All right. Take a slow breath. Let the day fade out a little more, and let's drift back into the Renaissance. Still glowing softly, still humming with ideas, still full of brilliant people who were, frankly, a bit too dramatic for their own good. We've explored the artists, the money, the cities, and the early sciences. Now let's settle gently into the minds of the thinkers who gave this era its intellectual backbone. No shouting, no revolutions, just quiet, contemplative people, writing long letters by candlelight, because that's what you did before email ruined the charm. Renaissance humanists, Europe's original deep thinkers. Humanism wasn't a political movement. It wasn't a religion. It wasn't a secret society, even though some humanists definitely wrote like they were founding one. At its core, humanism was simple. Study humans, understand the world, use reason, improve yourself. Pretty wholesome, honestly. Humanists were obsessed with ancient texts. They found old manuscripts in dusty monastic libraries and read them like lost treasure. They admired Cicero more than most people admire their own relatives. They believed education could make people better, morally, socially, intellectually. It was a gentle sort of optimism, the kind that makes you sigh and think, well, at least someone tried. Petrarch, the man who kick-started the Renaissance without meaning to. Francesco Petrarch, often called the father of humanism, was basically a bookworm with commitment issues. He climbed mountains for fun. He wrote letters to long-dead Roman authors as if they'd respond. He kept journals full of melancholy thoughts about life, aging, and the difficulty of organizing his library. Petrarch didn't invent the Renaissance, but he did spark the curiosity that fueled it. His enthusiasm for classical learning spread like a soft, intellectual breeze through Europe. And because the Renaissance loves a dramatic contradiction, Petrarch was also a priest who wrote dozens of love poems to a woman who might not have existed. Classic Renaissance behavior. Erasmus, the calm critic with a sharp pen. Desiderius Erasmus was like the polite guest at a chaotic dinner party. He observed everything,
made dry commentary, and tried desperately not to offend anyone, while still managing to critique half the European church with a smile. Erasmus was like the Renaissance in human form, mildly sarcastic, very smart, and constantly trying not to get dragged into political drama. Machiavelli, the guy who accidentally became a villain icon. Now, let's float over to someone a bit less wholesome. Niccolo Machiavelli lived in Florence and had a political career that can be best described as everything was fine until it absolutely wasn't. He served the Florentine Republic. Then the Medici returned to power, fired him, imprisoned him, tortured him, and told him to go away. So Machiavelli went home, sulked for a bit, and wrote The Prince, a political handbook that suggested leaders should act moral when possible, but ruthless when necessary. He wasn't promoting cruelty, he was describing reality. But the book became legendary for being the guide to being evil with style. His reputation never recovered. Poor Machiavelli just wanted a job. Instead, he became the patron saint of calculating rulers everywhere. Still, his ideas reflected Renaissance realism. Humans are complicated, power is messy, and rulers probably shouldn't trust anyone wearing too many rings. Science edges closer to the modern world. We've already dipped into anatomy and mathematics. Let's float further. Renaissance science wasn't explosive. It was subtle, quiet, like a candle burning steadily instead of a fireworks show. But those small steps mattered. They built the foundations for the scientific revolution that would follow. Copernicus, the gentle astronomer who moved the earth metaphorically. Nicholas Copernicus was a mathematician and astronomer who lived a quiet, unremarkable life in Poland, except for one tiny thing. He figured out the earth wasn't the center of the universe. Instead, he proposed the heliocentric model, the sun at the center, Earth moving around it. A simple idea, but a revolutionary one. Copernicus wasn't trying to shock anyone. He was too introverted for that. He delayed publishing his theory for decades, probably because he didn't want angry letters. When his book finally came out, he received a modest mix of curiosity and confusion. No huge drama, no torches and pitchforks, just people rubbing their chins like, interesting. The Renaissance was warming up to new ideas, slowly, cautiously, quietly. Alchemy, science's awkward cousin. Of course, not all Renaissance science was successful. Alchemy was still very popular. People genuinely believed they could turn lead into gold, cure diseases with mysterious elixirs, or brew the legendary Philosopher's Stone. It was half science, half wishful thinking. But alchemy wasn't useless. Alchemists experimented. They studied chemicals. They kept notes. They made accidental discoveries just often enough to keep patrons funding them. Alchemy was like science's eccentric older sibling, confused, overly dramatic, but occasionally brilliant. Renaissance architecture, calm geometry turned into stone. Now let's drift into architecture. Renaissance buildings had a soothing, balanced quality. Stable shapes, simple lines, symmetry that made you exhale a little more slowly. Architects rediscovered Roman styles, arches, domes, columns, and revived them with a fresh sense of proportion. Brunelleschi's dome, the chill engineering miracle. Florence's cathedral needed a dome, a massive one that medieval builders couldn't figure out without collapsing something important. So Brunelleschi improvised. He engineered a double shell dome, a structure so clever that engineers today still tilt their heads and say, "Yeah, that's pretty good." Florence got its iconic landmark, Brunelleschi got eternal fame, and the Renaissance got one of its clearest architectural statements. Beauty and math can be friends. Renaissance courts: lavish, competitive, and emotionally exhausting. Let's drift back into the courts again, the places where elites pretended to love philosophy while secretly competing over who had the bigger palace fountain. Court life was full of elegant dances, public spectacles, long debates about classical poetry, and the occasional political betrayal served with dessert. It wasn't peaceful, but it was polished. People dressed in bright colors. Perfume was finally a thing. Music became more complex. Dances became more coordinated. Even table manners improved, slowly, grudgingly. The Renaissance court was the birthplace of fashionable culture. Half intellectual showmanship, half social anxiety. Women of the Renaissance: quiet influence in a loud era. Women weren't given the stage often, but many still influenced culture. Some were scholars, some were poets, some ran salons where thinkers debated philosophy under soft candlelight. Others became patrons of artists or acted as political advisors behind the scenes. One example, Isabella d'Este, the First Lady of the Renaissance. She collected books, sponsored artists, managed her court, corresponded with intellectuals, and basically ran her small state whenever her husband was busy doing whatever Renaissance husbands did. Her personal motto might as well have been, "I'll do it myself." Women weren't always acknowledged, but they were essential threads in the tapestry. Music. Europe learns harmony.
If you're still awake after the last section, congratulations. You have officially survived 3 parts of wandering through early Renaissance chaos, collapsing guilds, and academics who argued about Plato like it was a national sport. So tonight, let's just drift a little deeper. Let's talk about the people who tried to shape the Renaissance, even when they had absolutely no idea what they were doing. Because yes, there were geniuses, but there were also a whole lot of well-meaning intellectual disasters. Just breathe, settle in, and float with me into another quiet gallery of Renaissance awkwardness. The humanists who really wanted to be cool. So let's start with the humanists again. The guys who proudly declared that they were bringing back the glory of ancient Greece and Rome, even though most of them had never seen a Greek ruin and thought a broken column meant instant wisdom. Humanists were convinced they were the elite scholars of Europe. But the truth? About half of them were basically book collectors with a superiority complex. Imagine modern people who buy huge hardcover philosophy books to decorate their shelves and never actually read them. That gives you the vibe. Still, they were charming in their own way. They wrote long letters to each other about the noble dignity of man, usually while sitting in cold, dimly lit rooms, coughing from terrible plumbing and questionable bread. But hey, they had spirit. And honestly, the Renaissance needed that. One fun thing they loved doing was trying to imitate Cicero's Latin. Not just regular Latin, oh no. They wanted Cicero's exact rhythm, grammar, structure, the whole vintage package.
This led to hours of heated arguments. Imagine a group of grown men yelling about verb endings like they were debating the fate of civilization, because they believed language shaped thought. So if your Latin wasn't perfect, apparently your soul wasn't either. Now, let's drift over to Italy's brilliant weirdos. Italy, during the Renaissance, was basically the world's most chaotic talent show. Artists, scholars, engineers, mercenary captains, everyone scrambling for a patron, a paycheck, or at least a decent loaf of bread. And in the middle of that mess came the true Renaissance minds, the ones who weren't pretending, the ones who were actually doing mind-blowing work even if they had no stable income, questionable hygiene, and a habit of fighting other scholars over nothing. Enter Leonbattista Alberti, the Renaissance's answer to the guy who says, "I do a little bit of everything," and actually means it. He was an architect, a mathematician, a cryptographer, a dramatist, a moral philosopher, a linguist. Because, why not? Multitasking was basically his personality trait. He also wrote a book on painting that told artists to study math, which instantly made half of Italy panic, because math was terrifying and no one wanted to admit they couldn't add properly. Alberti believed beauty came from proportion, a very calm, very soothing idea, until artists started trying to calculate perfect symmetry at 3 in the morning with candles melting onto their sketches. But still, he pushed Europe forward, one quietly obsessive sentence at a time. The Renaissance and its obsession with perspective. Let's drift towards something actually relaxing. Linear perspective. Perspective was like magic to early Renaissance painters. Finally, they could make a room look like a room instead of a flat cardboard backdrop. Before this, medieval paintings basically said, "Depth? Never heard of her." Suddenly, artists started using vanishing points. They measured horizons. They sketched with little grids like extremely determined children practicing handwriting. And the result? Spaces that felt real, calm, balanced. Kind of perfect for sleep, honestly. But perspective also turned artists into dramatic mathematicians. They would scream at their assistants over angles. They would erase a single line 50 times. Some even fainted over misaligned geometry. All for the sake of depth, which is poetic and very Renaissance. Let's float over to medicine, which was trying its best. Okay, now we glide into Renaissance medicine, a field that thought it was getting more scientific, but was still mostly guesswork wrapped in confidence. Doctors were obsessed with ancient physicians like Galen. They acted like quoting him made them instantly correct, even if the patient looked like they were seconds away from becoming a historical statistic. But some Renaissance physicians were innovative, though. They studied anatomy, sometimes illegally. They drew diagrams that were surprisingly accurate, even if they had to steal bodies to do it. Yes, the Renaissance was beautiful, but it also had a lot of midnight anatomy students dragging suspiciously human-shaped bags through alleys, quietly, very quietly. But this era gave us new scientific habits: observation, recording, questioning tradition. A soft, steady restructuring of how Europe understood the human body, without any dramatic breakthroughs that would wake you up. Astronomy. The sky starts getting complicated. Let's drift a little higher, into the sky. Renaissance astronomy was slowly turning into a battlefield of polite disagreements. Not shouting, just a lot of murmured,
That seems unlikely while staring at diagrams. Astronomers began noticing that the ancient geocentric model, the Earth at the center version, didn't fully match what they observed. But because they didn't want trouble with the church, they mostly whispered their doubts into notebooks and hoped no one read them. Still, star charts became more accurate. Instruments improved. Spherical Earth models became common again. Yes, again, because medieval people didn't actually think the Earth was flat. That's a modern myth. Medieval scholars just had different priorities, like trying not to die from questionable cheese or a sudden invasion. The Renaissance simply gave Europe time to look up and think. Slowly, sleepily. Philosophers who thought too hard about everything. As we drift along, let's check in with the philosophers, the ones who sat in gardens or libraries, staring at the ceiling until someone paid them to write a book. These thinkers were obsessed with human nature. What makes a person morally good? What makes society function? Why do people keep doing the same foolish things over and over? Plenty of Renaissance thinkers came up with wild theories. Some said education would fix humanity. Others said everyone needed spirituality. A few confidently declared that reason alone could guide mankind, which is adorable, given how the next century has turned out. But they tried, and that's what matters. The Renaissance wasn't about being right. It was about seeking answers, calmly, stubbornly, with a quill and too much candle wax. Quietly drifting toward the High Renaissance. So now, we slowly float toward the cusp of the High Renaissance, the era when everything gets polished, artists get bolder, philosophers get deeper, scientists get braver. But all of that comes later. Right now, we're still in the tranquil rising tide, the early to mid-Renaissance. Europe is waking up, stretching, blinking, but not rushing.
If you're still awake, I honestly admire your commitment. By this point, you've floated through guilds, humanists, awkward scholars, and more perspective grids than any reasonable person should encounter before bed. So tonight, let's keep the drift going. Let's slide into the late 1400s and early 1500s, that dreamy transitional moment when Europe was quietly getting ready to unleash Michelangelo-level drama, but hadn't quite worked up the energy yet. Think of this as the Renaissance stretching its arms, yawning, and saying, "Okay, let's get serious." Florence, the city that acted like an overachieving cousin. Let's begin in Florence again. Yes, Florence, because the city was basically the Renaissance's gifted but exhausting relative, always achieving, always innovating, always bragging about something. By the late 1400s, Florence had turned into a cultural pressure cooker. Patrons wanted more impressive art. Artists wanted more freedom. And bankers, mostly named Medici, because apparently Florence only produced like 6 surnames, wanted more glory. The Medici family loved art the way modern billionaires love luxury electric cars. Part passion, part status symbol, part, "Look how superior I am." But their obsession paid off. They created the perfect environment for artistic growth. Money plus ambition plus political chaos equals creative explosion. Florence became a place where you couldn't walk down the street without bumping into someone drawing a nude figure, debating Plato, or complaining about taxes. It was magical in a very exhausting, introvert-unfriendly way. Let's float toward the workshops. Art workshops in the late 1400s were, well, chaotic is the polite word. Each workshop was like a noisy beehive, except the bees were teenage apprentices covered in paint. They spent their days grinding pigments, stretching canvases, and listening to their masters complain about perspective. Again. But these workshops mattered. They shaped the giants of the next era. This is where young artists learned to sketch human anatomy without panicking, where they learned to mix paints that didn't crack within a week, where they learned how to flatter wealthy patrons by making them look less tired and more Renaissance-y. By now, artists were trained not just as craftsmen, but as thinkers. Philosophy classes, geometry, anatomy, the full uncomfortable curriculum. In these workshops, you can almost feel the high Renaissance sneaking up behind everyone, slowly, softly, like a quiet guest arriving early to a party. A gentle glide to the north. The Renaissance spreads. Now let's drift northward, because despite what Italy likes to imply, the Renaissance wasn't an exclusive club. Ideas traveled, slowly, on horses, on foot, on ships that probably smelled questionable, but they traveled. By the mid to late 1400s, places like France, Germany, and the Low Countries were waking up to this whole art and science reboot thing. Northern Europe took the Renaissance and gave it a twist. Less drama, more detail, much more uncomfortable-looking clothing, and a deep love of painting every single fold of a garment, even if it took a decade. The result was art that felt sharper, colder, more introspective. Italian art said, "Look at this idealized beauty." Northern art said, "Look at this person's pores." All of them. Both approaches were brilliant. Both were exhausting to the artists involved, and both helped shape the modern mind. The printing press, Europe's unexpected sleep deprivation device. Now let's gently wander into one of the most accidental revolutions of the age. Johannes Gutenberg and his printing press. Invented around the mid-1400s, just when Europe was starting to get bored of hand-copying manuscripts at the speed of continental drift. Before printing, books were precious, rare, and written in handwriting so tiny you'd need divine intervention to read it clearly. But printing was Europe's equivalent of suddenly discovering the internet. Information exploded everywhere. More books, more pamphlets, more treatises complaining about society, more poetry collections that absolutely no one asked for. Humanists loved it. Church officials feared it. Scholars obsessed over it. And medieval scribes cried quietly in their monasteries because their job was now endangered. Knowledge was no longer locked in dusty libraries. Now it existed in thousands of copies, spreading like a gentle intellectual breeze across the continent. This accelerated everything. Ideas moved faster. Debates grew bigger. People argued more confidently and often more incorrectly. Very Renaissance, very human. Science begins stretching its legs. Now let's drift toward early science. Nothing too dramatic, just the soft rewiring of Europe's brain. By the late 1400s, more scholars were done taking ancient texts at face value. They started doing something absolutely wild, testing things. Observation, measurement, experimentation. These were becoming fashionable in academic circles, even if actual results were questionable. Doctors tried new surgical methods. Astronomers made cleaner star charts. Engineers built machines that were impressive on paper and slightly terrifying in real life. There was still plenty of confusion, plenty of mistakes, but the direction was changing. The Renaissance wasn't a dramatic leap. It was a slow, sleepy shift, one tiny step at a time. Mathematics gets a makeover. Math in the late 1400s stepped forward too. Italy discovered double-entry bookkeeping, which changed commerce forever, even if it sounded painfully boring. Algebra texts started circulating thanks to the printing press. Merchants learned new calculation techniques. Architects used math to refine structures. Artists used it to shape compositions. Math became a language of innovation instead of a terrifying punishment inflicted upon students. Well, it remained terrifying, but at least now it was useful. Renaissance exploration, the calm before global consequences. Okay, let's gently glide toward the age of exploration. Not the dramatic, thunderous version we get in school books, but the quieter buildup. Europeans had been trading with far regions for centuries, but their maps were still a jumble of hopeful guesses and wildly inaccurate coastlines. By the late 1400s, new ship designs, better navigation tools, and widespread curiosity created a sort of calm, anticipatory energy. Explorers wanted to go further. Cartographers wanted better maps. Merchants wanted new trade routes. This wasn't yet the full storm of global expansion, conflict, and colonization. That came later. Right now, we're just floating through the early, slightly naive optimism of it all. People peered at the horizon and thought, maybe we should see what's out there. And Europe, for better or worse, was ready to stretch beyond its borders. The Church, Reformation rumblings in a sleepy tone. Now let's drift back into something quieter. Religion. The Catholic Church still dominated European life, but by the late 1400s, gentle cracks appeared. Not dramatic, lightning-filled cracks, but just small murmurs. People noticed corruption. They noticed wealth accumulating at the top. They noticed priests who probably shouldn't have been priests. Humanists began calling for reform. Writers published small criticisms, carefully worded, hopefully unpunishable. Scholars argued that Christianity should return to its roots, its simplicity, its moral clarity. These whispers didn't wake Europe up yet, but they signaled that major changes were drifting closer. Slowly, calmly, like a reformist breeze knocking politely at the window. Renaissance daily life gets slightly better. Now let's soften our focus and look at everyday life, because while the Renaissance transformed ideas and art, it also gradually, very gradually, made life a little more comfortable. Cities improved infrastructure. Trade routes expanded.
If your eyes are getting heavier, good. That means the Renaissance is working. Because nothing puts people to sleep quite like a slow stroll through 1500s Italy, where every artist is stressed, every patron is dramatic, and every church is under construction for roughly 2 centuries. Tonight, we're drifting into the early High Renaissance, the era most people think of when they hear the word Renaissance, even though very few people actually know what was going on. Spoiler, it was mostly artists quietly having existential crises over marble blocks and unfinished commissions. So settle in, dim the lights, and let's wander into a world of genius, anxiety, and very questionable workplace environments. The calm before the genius storm. By the early 1500s, Italy had reached this strange, peaceful tension, like the deep inhale before a long symphonic note. Art was improving rapidly. Techniques sharpened. Workshops multiplied. Patrons kept demanding bigger and more ridiculous projects.
This was the moment when three extremely stressed men accidentally became legends: Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo Buonarroti, and Raphael Sanzio. The Renaissance didn't wake up one morning and decide to produce geniuses. It just happened. Mostly because rich people kept buying art and talented artists kept trying not to get fired. Leonardo da Vinci, the perpetual overthinker. Let's start with Leonardo, because of course we do. Leonardo was the Renaissance's favorite mystery man. Painter, scientist, engineer, anatomist, botanist, philosopher. He collected hobbies like modern people collect streaming subscriptions. He also had the attention span of a distressed butterfly. If Leonardo were alive today, he'd have 12 unfinished side projects, 3 work-in-progress novels, and a YouTube channel that uploads once every 2 years. His notebooks were filled with mirror writing, sketches of dreams, half-invented machines, and occasional grocery lists. He studied water, birds, flowers, storms, everything. He was basically curiosity wearing human skin. But did he finish all his commissions? Absolutely not. He left paintings half done. He disappeared from patrons for months. He worked slowly, painfully slowly. At one point, he spent 2 years living near a canal just to study how water moved. Because why not? But when he did finish things, they were breathtaking. The Last Supper turned biblical drama into quiet emotion. The Mona Lisa took subtlety to a whole new level. His scientific observations were centuries ahead of their time. Leonardo didn't try to be a genius. He just followed his curiosity into every corner of the world, quietly scribbling like a sleep-deprived philosopher. Michelangelo, the grumpy marble whisperer. Now let's drift over to Michelangelo, a man who was basically born irritated. If Leonardo was the dreamy overthinker, Michelangelo was the perpetually frustrated perfectionist. He sculpted like he was trying to win an argument with the stone, and somehow he always won. Michelangelo saw figures trapped inside marble blocks. His job, as he put it, was simply to set them free. Beautiful, poetic, also slightly concerning. He disliked painting, but the Pope forced him to paint the Sistine Chapel ceiling anyway. Michelangelo protested loudly, dramatically, and repeatedly. Then he painted one of the most iconic masterpieces in human history, because apparently even his complaints were masterpieces. Working conditions were not ideal. He painted while lying on scaffolding. Paint dripped into his eyes. His neck hurt, his back hurt, his soul hurt. He wrote poems complaining about the whole ordeal. But the result? Calm, delicate figures floating across the ceiling in a cosmic dreamscape. A visual lullaby born from a man having the worst time of his life. Raphael, the social butterfly of the Renaissance. And now, let's drift softly toward Raphael. While Leonardo was mysterious and Michelangelo was grumpy, Raphael was charming, effortlessly talented, effortlessly social, effortlessly everything. If Facebook existed back then, Raphael would have 3,000 friends and the Pope in his contact list. He understood harmony, balance, space, emotion. His paintings didn't scream genius, they whispered it. The School of Athens is a perfect example. Calm philosophers arranged like a gentle conversation. Soft colors, smooth gestures. Everyone looking like they'd just finished meditating. Raphael made art feel peaceful even when it was complicated.
He represented the elegant side of the High Renaissance, the version teachers love showing in classrooms because it doesn't involve screaming or existential dread. The High Renaissance look, calm, perfect, organized. By the early 1500s, art developed a certain serenity. Everything looked balanced, composed, almost too perfect, honestly. Artists blended realism and idealism. Bodies were accurate but gentle. Landscapes were calm and atmospheric. Faces had that soft, "I've been thinking about Plato all afternoon" expression. It was beauty with discipline, emotion without chaos, passion without mess. The Renaissance had finally matured. Gone were the awkward proportions, stiff shapes, and perspective experiments that looked like geometry accidents. Now everything flowed smoothly, a quiet river of creativity. Architecture gets dramatically calm. Now let's gently slide into architecture, because nothing lulls a person to sleep quite like floor plans and mathematical proportions. The High Renaissance brought a new harmony to buildings. Architects like Bramante wanted clarity, symmetry, calm geometry. Churches became open and bright. Spaces were measured with mathematical precision. Arches and columns returned, like ancient celebrities making a comeback tour. Everything was designed to feel stable, balanced, human-centered. It was architecture that whispered, "You may not understand philosophy, but at least you can stand in a nice building." The popes, patrons with very dramatic energy. We should also drift briefly into the Vatican, because while artists were quietly creating masterpieces, the popes were doing the opposite. The Renaissance popes were basically the CEOs of a massive political empire, running things with a mix of ambition, stress, and "please don't look too closely at my finances." Popes like Julius II treated art like a competition. He wanted bigger churches, more sculptures, more paintings, and he wanted them now. He bullied Michelangelo into sculpting, then bullied him into painting, then bullied him again for not working fast enough. All very holy, very spiritual, very Renaissance. But without these demanding patrons, many masterpieces wouldn't exist. Chaos produced beauty, just like the Renaissance loved to prove. Science quietly builds momentum. While artists were perfecting beauty, scientists were quietly questioning the universe. Astronomers improved models of the heavens. Mathematicians refined equations. Doctors dissected more bodies, legally sometimes, illegally more often. Europe didn't explode with scientific discovery yet, but the foundations were there, a soft hum of curiosity beneath the surface. The Renaissance mind trusted observation more than authority. It was the slow rise of a new logic, one that would eventually rewrite everything. The mood of the High Renaissance, a calm peak. The early 1500s had a mood, a tone, a vibe. Confidence without arrogance, innovation without frenzy, beauty without excessive drama. Everyone felt like they were living in a golden moment, even though they weren't aware it was temporary. Artists were experimenting calmly. Thinkers were exploring gently. Europe felt balanced.
The night felt endless. But when the first light of dawn touched the icy walls of the mountain, something changed. A warm glow spread slowly across the frozen world, soft and golden. Aaron and the team stood silently, their tired eyes reflecting the colors of the rising sun. The brutal cold of the previous night, the fear, the constant threat of the unknown, everything faded as the light grew. They realized one thing. Today is the final chapter. The light that reveals the truth. Aaron walked forward slowly, stopping at the edge of the summit. Below him stretched a world of white silence, frozen rivers, endless valleys covered in snow, and a sky filled with glowing mist. Suddenly, the ground beneath his feet cracked. The team shouted, "Aaron, step back!" But Aaron didn't move. Something inside him whispered that this mountain had been calling him all along. This place was hiding a truth only he could uncover. He took out the old journal Moshe had found earlier. The last page had a strange symbol, an incomplete circle, and beneath it, "When the final veil of sunlight rises, the last door will open." Aaron's heartbeat quickened. He looked at the sunlight falling directly on the circle of ice beneath him. This was the moment. Suddenly, a deep thud echoed through the mountain. The ice split open. Light, strange, glowing, shimmering, poured out from underneath. Blue, gold, red, 3 colors blending like liquid fire. Moshe yelled from behind, "That's not natural light! This is man-made!" Aaron knew it. This was the secret. The lost civilization the old pirate legends spoke about. He knelt and brushed away more ice until a stone door appeared, covered in symbols. And at the center, the same incomplete circle from the journal. Aaron whispered, "This is it, the final door." When he touched it, the door slowly opened on its own. The chamber of the frozen beings. Inside was a massive hall made entirely of crystal-like ice that never melted. Along both walls stood figures carved out of stone. Warriors, women, children, strangers from a forgotten time. And at the center of the hall, a giant sphere of glowing crystal. Its inner light pulsed like a heartbeat. Moshe stepped forward with trembling hands. This is proof, a real civilization, one that mastered the cold." Aaron moved closer to the sphere. The moment his fingers touched it, the entire hall lit up, and every stone statue opened its eyes, glowing with light. A soft, ancient voice echoed, "Aaron, you have finally come." Aaron froze. "Who are you?" "We are the last guardians of this world of ice. We kept ourselves asleep to protect the truth until someone worthy arrived." Aaron whispered,